University of Oregon graduates who were working at the News Review, which is the Roseburg newspaper. And both of them, their phones blew up. And it was people from all over the country and as far away as Europe saying, while they're reporting the story, saying, hey, can you come on? We want to ask you a couple of questions. And so this idea that we need to be in a big hurry to get information out there very quickly, and that there's some sort of value that they think someone is placing a value on in this information, that we have to get it out quickly, that's hurting us. Because then when we get it wrong, which we inevitably do because the news is changing as we go through it, then it becomes not just a mistake, but again, now it's fake news. It's out there and it discredits everything, including the reporters who are doing a very hard job trying to figure out what happened on site immediately. So I feel like this idea of let's slow down, let's breathe for a couple of seconds. And I'm in an awkward position. I teach live tweeting in my reporting classes because that's a skill that our students need to know how to do. I once spent nearly a year live tweeting Board of Trustees committee meetings at Penn State. I've done it. There is very little context that you are able to provide as you're trying to figure out which 140 characters to use. However, I also tried to do something long-term afterward and be able to say, okay, here's what all those little pieces of information really meant. And honestly, sometimes it's easier to sell that quick news that's coming, those quick bits of information, than it is the longer, more in-depth piece. So I'm a little bit of a fraud, but at the same time, you have to be able to do both. I also teach sports journalism, as Mark mentioned. So you kind of have to be a sprinter and you have to be a marathoner at the same time. So there's this way that you have to be able to get some information out quickly, but thinking long term and thinking, how can I do this? I want to give an example from when I was an editor. I had a reporter come in and say, I was working in St. Louis, Missouri at the time, and the men's Final Four was there, which was a big deal for the city, and the city wanted the NCAA to keep coming back and doing this. And a reporter came running into the office and he said, I have this great story. He said, there's something going on. The police are basically demanding tickets to be able to do things from the NCAA, and the NCAA is really angry at what the police are saying about this. So they may pull all their future events because they don't want to be treated like this by the police. And I was like, whoa, big story, right? And he wanted to run it. And I said, well, how do you know this? What he said was, I said, how many sources do you have? And he said, I have 3. And I said, great. How do your sources know that? And he said, I don't know. They just know it. And I said, well, can you go back and ask them all? Because I want to know. So that took him a little while. He had to track people down again. He had to go over some pieces. And when he came back, he was very sheepish. And he said, it was all the same source. So there was one person who had heard a rumor and had passed it on to 3 other people. So I like to think of that as an example of slow news, that we took the time to go back and say, how did you know all those things? And then that enabled us to not give an incorrect story to the readers. And as part of that, I want to mention also that I think when you hear slow news, you probably automatically think long form, right? Like there's something about, well, if it's slow, it's going to take a long time to read. It's going to be this idea. I don't like the phrase long form journalism. It seems like the characteristic of it is that it's long. I would prefer for it to be engaging or interesting or narrative or something else. I don't use the word long form. But that said, the story that this reporter was talking about, the stories that happen after a mass tragedy or a shooting are not long stories. It just takes more time to get them right. So I guess what I would say is I feel like that slow news can still happen, doesn't have to happen in 10,000 words, right? It can be a short story. And I think that kind of mentality would help us in many ways. I'll pass that along. Thank you.
And here it all goes. And we hope you all are hearing us clearly. Is it all working, the technology?
It's all working great.
Give us a thumbs up. Yeah? Okay, terrific. And here I present to you by flipping the machine over the table is our colleague Daniela Krause.
Hi.
Welcome. I will talk really slowly because this is a weird situation to have you all here in the virtual space. Yeah, we talked about the topic yesterday here in beautiful Perugia, and it's a pity that you can't be here because it's really beautiful and they have wonderful food and wine here in Italy. And when I started to think about the concept of slow news, for me, it is very near to organic food, because why do we want organic food? Because we want to know what's in it, and we want to know how it is produced, and we want to know that it's good for us, and it's that it not only looks like nice food, but there is nice stuff inside that's good for our brain and our body. And for me, that's a very wonderful way to look at slow news too, because I think that too fast news are not good for our brain. To keep it in a very simple way, I think we have two sides to consider. The one is the production side, which was already discussed, and the other is the reception. And Peter already mentioned that there's lots of stress involved in getting too much information at a very short time. But I think that it's also another problem, because I referred yesterday on our panel to the research of Daniel Kahneman, who is dealing with the brain and how it works. And there are people who are very deep in this topic, but what I think is very interesting for our discussion is that he differentiates between two systems of thinking, and the one is the fast thinking and the other one is the slow thinking. And whereas the fast thinking is very emotional and instinctive and spontaneous and intuitive, the slow one is reflective and logic and gives you context. But the slow one is the one that makes work. So it's much harder, of course, to activate this slow thinking process. And I think for the media and for the journalists, we have to support this slow thinking, because it doesn't come automatically. So the fast thinking is what comes automatically. You just do it. But the slow thinking is really work, and I think it would be very important to support audience to think slowly. There's another issue to that, because you all know that there is a lot of discussion now about confirmation biases. And if you get very fast news and they have not this reflective aspect, and they don't give you the context to make it possible for you to consider what is how can I build my opinion, then of course you very much confirm what you already know, and you only have pieces of information that don't make it possible for you to get the context. So I think, as you said, we have to be sprinters and marathoners at the same time. I think there is a huge need for fast news, but there is a responsibility for slow news too. Yeah, that's my point here, and I hope we go on discussing, and we can also discuss.
And we can turn the machine over to Catherine.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, it's a little delayed on our end. So I wanted to talk a little bit about solutions journalism and its relationship to slow news. And if you're not familiar with solutions journalism, it's an emerging journalism practice that's focused on framing news in a solutions-oriented way, rather than the traditional frame of news, which is always problem-oriented or almost always problem-oriented. So just a sort of quick example, usually some report will come out about the 10 cities with the worst crime in America, let's say, and the reporters will write about that. But they never look and see which are the 10 cities with the lowest crime, or which are the 10 cities that have had the greatest drops in crime, and not just which are those cities, but how did they actually achieve that. So very quickly, again, just in case you're not familiar, solutions journalism is journalism. It's not advocacy. So it shares the same qualities as traditional journalism, but it just flips the frame in its approach. And I think that the key here is that that type of journalism takes time. It really focuses on the how. Instead of having a whodunit structure, solutions journalism focuses on what they've coined as its supporters have coined as the howdunit structure. And that how, reporting for how, takes a great deal of time, because you have to get really granular to say, well, how did this program actually work? And then what happened? And then what happened? And then how did you actually teach those children to write better sentences? So it really takes time. It's also never a breaking news situation. It's a second day story, a third day story, or possibly even much later, where you go back and you look at gains in society over time. And so, it's not contributing to that fast news problem. The other thing that I would say that goes along with this issue of lack of trust and how fast news contributes to our trust issue with our publics and our audiences is that when we give people only a diet of problem-oriented stories, we're not really giving them the whole picture of the world. And most people's lives are not just all problems, they're a mix, right? I mean, everyone's life is a mix, and societies are a mix of problems and successes, and so, or responses to problems. And so we constantly feed our audiences diet of negativity and problem-framed stories, we're contributing to that cycle of mistrust and helplessness and even apathy, because people feel like, well, the world is just this, big old mess, and there's, problems from AIDS to poverty to, climate issues and so on. And so if we can show people, if we can do that slower work to show them people that are making a difference and institutions that are making a difference, we can actually help improve our trust issue with our audiences. Thank you very much.
So perhaps as this thing flies around the room, perhaps you all would like to have some sort of follow-up from here at the panel, or maybe much better, we throw it back to you in Portland, where, by the way, just about everybody we talk to here in Italy wants to come and visit and maybe move. So it's really strange how we all like Italy and they want to go there. But maybe it's better we go to the group.
Well, let's open it up to questions. So in the group, we need you to talk to the microphone, and let's realize there's a lag.
Where is the
camera is right underneath Peter's beard.
Okay. I just am curious.
And please do speak right into the microphone and accept the fact that there's a lag. We hear you fine.
Okay, great. I'm curious about funding sources in terms of slow media. I mean, there are certain things that I read that I think are more slow media, like the New Yorker, and I pay for that. But I mean, it seems like in the advertising age and the way that news is funded, the fast media is what gets the attention. So have you guys thought about financial models for funding slow news?
Who would like to tackle that? Yeah? No? Well, I'll tackle it while you guys think of what it is. Sure. And that's in this manifesto that I write, and please remember, the concept from my point of view, we're getting all of this terrific information from my colleagues here regarding news production. And my point of view is, what do we do as consumers? And so to that point, we are ludicrously spoiled by not just enjoying everything free, but expecting everything free. And that obviously is not sustainable. We all know about the various reasons for the current disruption in the traditional revenue model for journalism. And we are working as a society and as a profession and in the academy to try to figure out alternatives. But in the meantime, there's a really easy alternative to at least begin the process of getting that stuff paid for, because you're absolutely right. It costs a lot of money. So spend some. Spend some. We all need to buy some of this stuff. If we consider it of value, we need to buy it. And if you are looking at the New York Times or the Guardian regularly, you see that they're making overt pitches saying exactly this. This has got to get paid for. Is there something to add here? Lori is here.
So I think that Peter makes a good point, and I want to point out one thing, that a lot of the stories, if you were going to go through my career as a reporter and say, here's Lori's fast news stories and here's some slower news type pieces, most of those were honestly pieces even 25 years ago I wrote on my own. I wrote them on my own time. They were labors of love. They were something that I really cared about. And I think that's one of the problems with funding for journalism in general, is that those of us who do it, we do it because we love it. And we do it because it speaks to something us inside. And we don't always ask, how can I be compensated? Who will pay me for this? That it's very hard to stop, to let go of a story that you're really excited about, even if you're not maybe being paid. I don't want to know how much per hour I made for some of the stories that would be considered for slow news. I'm sure I could have worked at McDonald's and been far richer. So I think that's an issue. I think Peter's other point about the market value is really important, and that we need to make that better. I'm on a swim team, and since November, I have become the most popular person at 5:15 a.m. practice, because everybody wants to ask me, where can I get my news? What's happening with the news? And they don't want Twitter. They don't want something. They want something that's going to take a time. It's going to slow it. I swim with a retired ENT doctor, and every time I come to practice, he asks me, where can I pay my money to be able to do this? He said, I'm willing to pay, but I don't know who to pay. So I think that, there is a piece of this that the industry is disconnected from what the public wants. And I don't know how to fix that, but I'm on board.
We have another question here. I see my colleague Ed Madison. It's so nice to see.
How are you? How are you? So
we're all here.
So a little devil's advocate here for a moment, because let's say 8 months ago, when there was another administration in power, I could kind of wait and trust, kind of like what was going to go on. But now I get alerts almost every 10 minutes, and I'm afraid to look at them, but I also am afraid not to look at them. In terms of a sense of urgency about what's going on in the world. And so I'm just wondering, just what you think about that period, this period that we're in, where it just seems like, a North Korean missile or a Syrian, attack or something. How do we engage with that information in a slow way?
I can provide a test case, and then we'll hear from our colleagues, again, from the point of view of the consumer. I've been out of the country now for 3 weeks, and for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is my schedule, but also it's not easy for me to understand the news on the radio when it comes in Italian. I am not exposed to nearly the amount of news, even when I'm trying to suppress the amount I consume back home, as I am back home. And I'm surviving. And in fact, I'm feeling some of the il dolce far niente, this sweet idleness, this pleasant doing nothing in the midst of a rigorous schedule, of course, and a lot of work for whomever at the front office is listening to us as we talk here. But But the point being that we really can play catch up. We don't need to have it right away. And I want to give, if I may, just one quick example from my own experiences that I relate in the book, and then we'll hear from my colleagues. When the Newtown shooting happened in Connecticut, I was on my way to report a turtle story in the Mojave Desert, and I had landed at Los Angeles Airport. And as I got out of the Los Angeles sprawl, I found a jazz station, and I'm driving through this most gorgeous country, listening to the radio playing jazz like this room here we're in the hotel features. And then there was a bulletin that the shooting had occurred. And I had to make a decision to tune over to KNX, the all news radio station, CBS in Los Angeles, and follow this as I had 3 more hours to drive, or to slap my hand and realize I'm not there. It's 3,000 miles away. It's awful. And I can catch up with it later. I want to know what happened, but I can find out, because it plays also to what Lori was saying. Those early reports were full of errors, as they almost always are. So we have to discipline ourselves. You guys?
Just a short remark. I think it's about tuning the volume up or down. So what is really necessary for the audience to know immediately, and what is only a way to kind of fuel the indignation or the outrage. Because if the leader of my right-wing party in Austria, not to refer to your president, says again something extremely stupid, it's important to know for me that he, in general, says extremely stupid things, but I don't have to know every stupid saying immediately. That just fuels up my indignation, and I can discuss on Facebook and blah. But if something really important happens, then I have to know immediately. So I think it's about turning the volume of the breaking news. Yeah.
I just, it's sort of to reiterate, but it is tricky. Sometimes I thought to myself, well, do I really need one more story about the same thing? I'm a highly engaged person. I keep up with the news. So if I just don't listen to or just don't read one more story, I'll probably still be okay, and I'll probably still be informed. But I think you raised a really good point, Ed, because I had the same conversation with someone yesterday, and I said exactly what I just said, and the person said to me, yeah, but missiles could hit Syria in the time you tuned out. And I had to admit, you're right. And then I would be pretty disappointed and frustrated if I found it out 10 hours later. So it isn't easy. I mean, it's challenging to do that, to have that discipline and then miss something.
Yeah, and sometimes that it can be a nice ostrich with the head in the sand. I went to bed knowing Hillary Clinton had won the election, so that made me sleep a lot better. But maybe I can challenge you, Ed, and when I get back, we can see if we can go through one day without turning anything on.
So Peter, this is Doug Blandy. I'm going to challenge you. Can our democracy survive sweet idleness right now?
Yeah, I'm not without words. I'm thinking, because it's a appropriate question to answer slowly. I would submit, Doug, that we, of course, have extraordinary work to do to save our democracy. But if we pepper that work with some sweet idleness, we might be able to do a better job than if we are just going non-stop in our responses, our visceral and other responses. So that's my response. Here's Lori's.
Hi. Twice since the election, I have reread Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death, which is a piece of media criticism that was written in the mid-1980s. And he submitted that as media becomes more about entertainment and less, if the first product is your first goal is to engage or to enjoy that. That's not the same as getting the big picture. That's not the same as getting the deep understanding that you need. So I think the idea that, and I can give myself as an example, I turned off some of the news alerts on my phone because I was driving myself bananas. My husband suggested that I get off the Twitter repeatedly. So there's a difference. You can be engaged, I think, and not get the minute by minute update. And even living on the West Coast, I've been at Oregon for 2.5 years now, and I came from Pennsylvania. And the difference between waking up and then seeing everything that happened on the East Coast for 3 hours before I got up has been very different to me. And sometimes I get up and I feel behind. I'm like, oh my gosh, what got tweeted? What happened? What's going on today? But I'm finding that if I cannot jump on my phone immediately, I think the technology has made it to the fact that we feel like we have to be on top of it all the time. And I think that moment of reflection, I know what's going on, and I have found myself actually just the less than a week I've been here in Italy that I am on Twitter less and I am reading more, like bigger picture. Like I am not getting my news from Twitter. I'm getting it from the Times. I'm getting it from the Guardian. I'm trying to look at anything I can see, and that's making a difference. But it's very hard because there is, as Daniela mentioned, that kind of like you want to be rewarded for something and that fast brain and get that going. So it is difficult. But I think you can pay very intense attention and not do it quickly. And I have others who want to speak.
Here's another response, Doug.
Just a short remark, because I think we really have to take care of ourselves, be it as consumers, be it as journalists who produce news. Because if you think about various theories about how you can be productive, the first and most important thing always is take care of yourself. Because if you don't take care of yourself, you can't contribute and co-create with others. And I think it's really important if you don't take care of having a clear mind, because it also blurs your perception of what's happening. If you're always online and everything comes to you with the same volume as noise. So I just thought maybe there are some developers in the audience. I want to have a dashboard of volume for which kind of news I want to tune up and which I want to turn down.
Good idea. No? Okay. Back it comes. I hope that's responsive. And we have another question here.
Peter, this is your friend, maybe soon to be ex-friend, David Frank. And I wanted to challenge the binary you've created, slow versus fast. And you're suggesting that slow is better, fast is not. But there are some slow news sources. For example, the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal that represents slow news that I think is atrocious. And there are times in which we do need to have our news quickly or fast. And so the binary you set up, I think, can be interrogated, because it seems to suggest that fast news itself is an evil. And wouldn't it be better to reconceptualize how we process information, make sure that ideologies don't overshadow the facts that ought to be gathered? Because often the New York Times does gather fast news, quote unquote, in a coherent way. And I read the New York Times report on the 51 Tomahawk missiles that were fired on Syria, and it seems that they accurately captured what happened. So again, that binary.
Yes, and thank you for drawing attention to that. And we are still friends. And my point of view on that is not that we don't ignore the breaking news, but the Newtown shooting as an example of something to find out later, as opposed to, unfortunately, another shooting, the Umpqua shooting, which affected us directly in Eugene. It affected us because the Umpqua Community College is a feeder college to us. It affected us because it is our greater community. Roseburg is part of us, even though it's an hour away. It affected us because our students went down as reporters who were pressed into service by national news organizations. It affected us because it's close enough that our community has ties and people may have been affected there, people we work with or we know. So it's not that kind of a binary, and excuse me if I presented it in that manner. I think that, again, the onus is on us because the material is there to decide what we're going to make use of when and in what kind of a pattern. So if you decided, David, that it was important to know these details about the missiles going into Syria, which makes sense, then you chose an outlet you trusted, because another one of the news rules is to learn over time what you can trust. If you find offensive or otherwise repugnant the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal, then you know to avoid it. Although I recommend, in fact, in the manifesto that you do seek out news sources you disagree with in order to keep some sort of understanding of what's going on in the rest of the world. And although the Wall Street Journal editorial page may be offensive, at least it's well written. So that's important. Almost dumped over the Cinzano in my enthusiasm here, trying to talk with my hands here in Italy.
Just one short again sort of pushback and following up on what Doug and David said in terms of democracy. So when the initial travel ban came out, and the response was people coming to airports and in their outrage, healthcare debate and people showing up at town meetings, had they slowed down and waited days or weeks to find out that information, the response might not have been as robust and as significant. So I don't know, just my pushback on that.
Yeah, that seems like maybe a solutions question, yeah?
Well, I think that, with any of these approaches, I don't think it means that we don't need multiple types of news. We always need breaking news. We always need investigative news, and we always need features and critiques of new albums and theater. So I guess I would say that it's just to make room for the other types of news, not to only rely on one type of news at the expense of the other.
Yeah, and Lori has something else to add here, please. I could put my thumb in front of your face there. Excuse me.
Yeah, and I think that's important, and I agree that there's not a binary. I would say two things. First of all, you don't really need to write a manifesto for fast news. It's hardwired into what news is, so that trying to pull the conversation somewhere sometimes takes an extreme on the other side. So, Peter, I hope that's a part of that. The other part I would say about the immigration and the protests at the airports and how that happened, super important. And that's a great example of fast news that matters. But honestly, the most moving and what gave me the most understanding of what's happening in our country right now is a piece of slow news, which was a New York Times story about a small town. And one of the leading citizens in this small town happened to be an immigrant who was undocumented. And he was a pillar of the community in this town, in this small town. I'm sorry, I can't remember if it was Illinois or somewhere like that. But it was this incredible piece of writing about how the town was so surprised, but why is he being deported? He's one of the good people. He matters in our town. And that's a story that you don't get unless you take your time, unless you go somewhere different. There weren't a lot of reporters there. There was only one. I haven't seen that other story specifically anywhere else. So I think that idea that the combination of those moments at the airport, which showed a galvanization, which showed people's caring on that side and why it mattered to them, and then this other side that helped me understand and actually helped me question. I don't feel like I know a lot of answers. I feel like I ask a lot of questions, and that's just kind of how I'm wired. But I think the idea that you need both of them matters a lot.
Yeah, not mutually exclusive.
No.
Got another question?
Yes.
Hey, Pop.
Hello, son. So nice to see you.
Nice to see
My
you.
son, Michael Laufer.
I couldn't help pass up the opportunity to heckle you from another continent. So
what else is new?
Und Grüße an deine österreichische Kollegen. I had.
Yeah.
So I want to say hi. Hi.
Grüß dich. So,
Servus.
so thanks to all of you for the really thoughtful panel. It's really cool to hear all these wonderful ideas about how we should create news and how we can consume news. But as I imagine many of you are, we teach college students who are of a much younger generation, and they're the consumers of most of this fast news that seems to be all the rage. And despite the fact that we can sort of sit around in a very elite environment and pontificate about how we should handle things and what's best for creating news and consuming news, how do we work to try to create a social shift so that the people at large who don't enjoy our privileged status of being able to sort of decide for ourselves what we think is best will start to value this sort of qualitative measure of news rather than sort of a quantitative or a speed-based value of news?
Yeah, Lori is shaking her head yes and writing on her pad. So we're turning that over to her.
That'll teach me. I'm not going to write anymore. Clearly. I would say two things. I just taught our Gateway to Media class last term, which is our intro class to the School of Journalism and Communication, and had just under 150 students. And most of them wanted something bigger picture to read. Torsten Delstrand and I taught it together, and we got so many questions from people who said, what can we read that's more substantial? I've actually, since I've been teaching journalism, which is 7 or 8 years now, I still have to tell students to get on Twitter. Like, I don't think most of them are there. I often think that everyone on Twitter is a journalist. We're all tweeting at each other. And I feel like that's a lot of where this culture comes from. And I try to remember that, like, I'm not a normal news consumer. Like, my level of news consumption is stupidly high sometimes, but I'm, not only is that my interest, but I'm paid to do that. So of course I'm doing it. And I feel guilty when I disengage at times. But I find that students, for all that we feel like they're getting all their notifications on Facebook and they're Snapchatting and they're all that, they're wired differently in some ways, and a lot of them are looking for something slower. Every class that I've had them read a New Yorker article, I've had students subscribe and tell me that after class. And I know Catherine Cudditt, our colleague who teaches J100, which is our media professions class and public relations, has had the same experience. So I think just introducing students to some of that and giving them time to think through it makes a difference.
Catherine has something to add. Here she is.
And I think it's a really excellent question, and I think one of the ways we do it is also by providing different types of stories, such as potentially solutions-based stories, but there's also all different other models for journalism that are more engaging. And I think that's another thing. If we start to pull the veil back on our process, and annotate our stories and show our readers and audiences how we produce them, they come along for the ride more. And I think that's and also reporting stories more deeply, like reporting more from the bottom up. I think the younger generation is really, and research has shown. I just led a panel today with the comptroller for BBC World Service in English, and they did a lot of market research that showed that younger audiences prefer stories that inspire them to action and that show people making a difference in the world. So they actually commissioned 2 new series on the BBC. One was called World Hacks, where they show people around the world who are solving problems, and another series that was somewhat similar in scope, where the reporters would go out to different countries and look at how they were solving problems. And then it's called My Perfect Country. Then they had a group on the radio discuss the problem and the solution in detail and whether they would allow the country to make it to their perfect country list or not. They would kick some countries out. But there was one video that they had in this series about someone in a South American country who caught clouds in a very foggy area and constructed these things to catch clouds and to draw rain down to provide fresh water. And that video has been viewed 30 million times. It's one of their most successful videos. And again, this is based on market research that shows that younger audiences prefer these types of stories. So I think, again, part of the way to attract them is to change how we tell stories. Again, not letting go of the accountability journalism or the breaking news, but to add more to the diet that we give our younger audiences.
And Daniela, and you can speak in German since it's Michael's question. No, don't do that.
Yeah, that would be very comfortable for me, but I will stick to English. I think it has three aspects. The first is we have to experiment more with formats, because we have, I don't know, maybe do YouTuber style news. Hi! Who knows? I don't know. But we can try. Second is, and I think that doesn't only apply to the younger audience, but in particular, we have to explain, and the industry totally failed in this aspect. From my point of view, we have to explain what journalism is and what makes it different from other information that is available. And the third and most important for me is that we have to listen. We have to listen to young audiences. And I'm, like conference hopping. And how many times have I listened to panels with 4 people, guys, or maybe also women, older than 45, talking about, as we do now, but we are young, of course, talking about how we can reach young audiences. And I think this is not only stupid, it's absurd. So what we did, for example, because we're doing training for journalists, and recently we launched a series of talks. It's with the title "What I Do on the internet," and it's only for speakers that were born later than the year 2000. And they explain what they are doing. It doesn't depend if they are talking about news consumption or what else. It's just to understand what they are doing. And it's interesting for me because, and now I come back to our topic, is that what they are doing, it's really slow. I don't know if you are watching Let's Play videos. It's the slowest and the most boring, but thing you can imagine, but it's so slow. So I think maybe they really want slow news. I'm not sure.
And then one other point, which is, and this goes, if I may, just to the question, and that is what we as supposed educators are supposed to do. And more of us at the School of Journalism and Communication are requiring the New York Times in our classes, which is distributed at no cost to students in the lobby of Allen Hall. And more we're hearing students, after they fail a few quizzes along the way because they haven't been reading it, at the end of the term saying, yeah, I'm going to continue to read this.
We are talking about elites.
We are talking about elites, yes and no. We are a public university, and we are a university for the people.
Buonasera. Vicente, can you hear me?
Buonasera.
We traded places. I'm Antonio Lopez. I teach at John Cabot University in Rome. So come visit me next week if you're coming through Rome. I arrive on Monday, and my email address is alopez@johncabot.edu. So let's have coffee, a cafe. Now, as I was listening to you guys, I was thinking about maybe reconceptualizing, as opposed to slow and fast, but the news media as a news ecosystem that has different things in it, and that we are able, just like slow food is part of an ecosystem, and sometimes we need the stuff that has to be mass produced, and then we need the slow stuff. But one thing I've noticed, which excites me about the current news ecosystem, is the prevalence of nonprofits that are producing investigative journalism, like Desmog Blog, Climate News Network, I think it's called. The other one, ProPublica. When I was in college, I interned at the Center for Investigative Reporting back in the 1980s in San Francisco, and I think that was one of the first or earliest nonprofits. But I think all these nonprofit investigative journalism organizations are contributing a lot to this ecosystem. And I know that like the New York Times, or I mean the LA Times, have done some partnerships with some of these organizations. So I don't know if it's really a question, but maybe if you could comment on your feeling about the diversity of sources. And one other comment. I do think the Syria news story is a slow story because there are reports coming out that this gas attack may not necessarily be what we think it is. And it seems we need to have more slow coverage of what really happens with this gas, who did it, and what was, the situation that produced that attack.
Yeah, well, we seem to be nodding here and appreciating the comment and looking forward to having coffee with you in Rome. If we have no more questions, there's a question.
Yes, I have a question. How are you doing, Peter?
I'm doing well, Dean. It's nice to see you. Welcome back from Venezuela. We're very glad they let you out of the country.
Thank you so much. Talking about Venezuela, in fact, I'm watching videos right now. Could we create a news speed continuum that for greater impact? For instance, right now there are demonstrations, protests in several cities in Venezuela, and the armed forces are, trying to control this population instead of allowing them free expression and free protest. I am fascinated about the fast news, watching what is going on real time, but at the same time, I'm looking forward till this afternoon or tomorrow to read reports, to put these fast news in context and in perspective. So, and I do believe in this case, for instance, the combination of what I'm watching right now, fast news, and slow news with more in-depth analysis of the demonstrations today in Venezuela will be more impactful, both to get to know the situation, but also to pressure the Venezuelan government from within and from external sources. So the question is, should developing a news speed continuum for greater impact may be probably wise to do without disqualifying either fast or slow news.
Yes, I think that goes back to what David Frank brought up, and your example is ideal here because you have this personal and professional interest in Venezuela. I would imagine everyone in the room has an overriding interest in Venezuela along with the rest of the world, but because of your history, you are following that in this manner. So you're deciding, as you call it, a fast, slow continuum. You're deciding where you want to put that in terms of knowing what's going on right now in that place that's so important to you. That maybe is similar to the Newtown, Roseburg examples, where the rest of us, if we don't have that kind of personal connection to Venezuela, perhaps can wait until tomorrow to read a dispatch in The Guardian or wherever we're getting our news. But absolutely, that's a solution. I think that over this conversation, we've all agreed that it isn't one or the other. They are not mutually exclusive. They work together.
All right.
Yeah.
Mike, I have a question actually, just really quickly.
Yes.
Please. The slow news metaphor, the slow news kind of comparison with slow food is interesting to me. I have another part of my world is a lot about food. And it seems like we're talking in a lot of ways around the, talking slow news in terms of like Whole Foods, right at the moment, so there's a lot of we're talking about this national and international level of news. But if you really look at slow food, it's about local. It's about very local, about people taking control at a very local level. And I'm not hearing about that. Now, I know there are at least a couple people in that room who do a lot of work with local news, particularly Catherine with the Snowden group. What's the state of local slow news in Oregon? Is there a state of it? I mean, what could we do to support that?
Yeah, I think that's a really great analogy and a great question. I think that the state is quite good. The state of the union is good. Nice to hear. I think I think in those communities, and Damian Radcliffe has directly done research in some of those communities, even some of the Snowden outlets, where those newspapers and news outlets do produce slow news, and they remain very trusted. It's very interesting. One of the Snowden outlets, I remember when Governor Kitzhaber was forced to resign, one of the editors told me that it was at a weekly, and he didn't put his editorial online, even though it was going to be late, right? Late, because he wanted to keep it in print. And I thought that was a really interesting decision, that for his readers, he made the choice that it was more important for them to see it in the format that they trusted and that would be meaningful to them. I do think that local news outlets are experimenting. In Oregon, the Klamath Falls Herald News is experimenting with augmented reality, but in a very local way. Some of you may have seen the editor came to SOJC and showed us how the youth baseball teams, they use augmented reality. You hold your phone over the picture of the local baseball teams, and you get this deeper knowledge, this in-depth details about a player. So I think that the state is quite good. How we could support it is a really interesting question. And I think, one way is to continue to send students there, especially because what students realize is that the issues that these communities face and the people in these communities are not so different than them. That's one of the big takeaways. I think how perhaps we could support it is maybe creating some sort of bureau for our students to cover the parts of the state that aren't being covered and help provide that in-depth local coverage that is so valued. So if anyone has the money for that, let me know.
Yeah, and Lori has a point here to make, and then we'll sum up from here in Perugia so we can go to dinner. It's almost 10 o'clock. It's almost dinner time.
I want to go back to Juan Carlos's comment about the continuum of news. That you kind of have to be, in my opinion, you have to learn to do the breaking and the fast. There's a process to be able to do the longer stories and the stories that take more time. So what I worry about is, as when there's not funding, as from the previous question, newsrooms are smaller, there's fewer editors, there's fewer people to help you do this, that the younger reporters who largely make up these local newspapers, because once you get a family and you have a salary, it's harder to keep going at that level, they don't always have the experience to be able to make that happen. An example from Roseburg was that our two very sharp young alums who were working there found out that the alarm system, that the notification on campus did not go out to people when the shooting happened. And that's a story that got no national play at all because they didn't quite know how to do it. And they didn't have an editor who was able to guide them in a way who was able to get the depth that's required in those type of stories. So when I think about what we can do as a school or as a university to support something that we all have an interest in our state, some of it is providing mentoring systems, is connecting people so that when we have young reporters at a small newspaper who don't maybe have at this time an editor who can coach them up to that level, that we're able to find a way to plug them into some networks and help. And I think that knowing that you have to take time to make this kind of news, that we can help there, if that makes sense.
That makes sense. So Mark, you're back there running the show, and the clock here suggests we have pretty much run it. Maybe we get a word from each of the panelists here before we say goodbye. Does that work for you?
Sounds delightful.
And we so appreciate the interaction with all of you. It will stimulate our dinner conversation. Let's start with Daniela Kraus, who is from the Forum Journalismus und Medien in Vienna. And as Mark mentioned at the beginning of our panel, we have forged a very close working relationship between the School of Journalism and Communication and the Forum Journalismus und Medien, and we're so glad to have her here with us.
Yeah, maybe I had to think all the time about the first time I got to know the concept of slow news from you, Peter, in Vienna. And there's one thing we didn't mention this evening, but I think it very much fits our surrounding here because we are in the city of chocolate. And what Peter said at this time was that our use of news and how we use our devices, it's very much like very young children who see chocolate in the windows and cakes and they eat all of this. And we still have to learn to keep a healthy and a good diet that doesn't make us crazy and hyperactive and oversugared with news.
Thank you, Daniela. And from our faculty at the School of Journalism and Communication, our colleague, Catherine Pugh.
Yeah, I mean, I think, something that I think about all the time is that journalists view themselves as the guardians of democracy, which we are. But at the same time, I think journalists for too long haven't been concerned with the effect they have on the people that they cover and the communities they cover. And research has shown that we actually have a literally depressing effect where we create a sense of learned helplessness, we create or engender compassion fatigue, and this endless diet of fast news, negative news, problem-oriented news. And I just think it's really important for journalists to step back and consider the effect of their news, because if you're doing it to be a guardian of democracy, but the things you produce are actually creating the opposite effect, then you're sort of, cutting yourself off at the knees. So I just really appreciate this discussion and all these different strands that have been brought in to sort of point us towards a way that might be more holistic and more complete while accomplishing the goals of journalism at the same time.
And from our faculty, Lori Shantz.
Thank you so much. I would just say I think the biggest thing that we can do as journalists and as journalism educators is that we can listen. And I think part of what we need to do is if we expect people to be more thoughtful about how they can news, we should be more thoughtful about how we produce it. And that in the case of things like solutions journalism, in the case of a lot of engagement issues, that we need to think that we shouldn't assume that we're always right, and that by listening to people who have a different perspective or who don't like our news, or people who push back against slow news or say fast news is good, I think the most important thing that we can do is to take the time to think about it ourselves.
And I would like to suggest that, as Catherine said, we're guardians of democracy, but it's also just great fun. And we have such a spectacular profession. So I would recommend that we periodically re-romanticize it. And I assign you all to read Evelyn Waugh's Scoop and to watch the front page. I recommend the second movie. It's a lot of fun, and it'll remind you of why we all do it. And thank you all for being a great audience, and thank you, Mark Blaine, for taking care of us back there at our home in Portland at the White Stag Block. Arrivederci.
Thank you, guys. See you back in Oregon.
Leave.
So I guess you could just kind of check these things. I don't know if it's just here. Those. Thanks a lot. A little bit of chaos in the beginning, but we survived. Yeah, great question. Intimidating to do that. It's one of those things where it's like, I might have to talk a lot to you.
So this one does have a blue jeans, a blind person, a video, and a live person. Can I with
White stag, exclamation mark with a capital W and a capital S.
doing that 2 years ago?
There's no space here.
Okay, this is under control. And then that's just going to be.
Sweet. We can write this down somewhere. Like,
White stag
So if you click on the yellow folder in the bottom, yeah, and you'll see yours on the left. Down below, it's like the O drive to the left of I. Oh, here. Yeah. So now if you unmaximize the window, drag whatever you want. I'm not. Wait, let me. It's just I'm not. You see that? I'm in the ditch. Grab his camera. Oh, it's right here. Oh, hey, look at that. Oh yeah, it's like 500. Something gig movie. The one we're showing in this. I'll just like the video. Yeah. Now this thing's being recorded, so if you guys want to be on the recording, right, turn it on and properly record. And we'll switch the camera view on our side, so it's instead of the so it's looking at the speaker instead of the. Yeah, no, you're good. You're totally right. Oh, what did you do there? You just turn it on? Turn it off. Otherwise, the person, the Bluetooth person, the address. And those are also active.
Hi. I'm sorry for the kind of inappropriate gesture of appearing at a conference about life as a disembodied image, but I'm afraid it's the best I can do right now. And I'm even more sorry about missing out on the best part of being on a panel, which is hearing what my fellow panelists have to say. But I'm grateful for the opportunity to participate, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about a project I've been working on called Biology of Story, which is an investigation of stories as forms of life and life as a form of story. What I'll share with you today is
Video and then the live. Was the Blue Jeans shared personalization? Blue Jeans. Or are they just showing this video? No, the Blue Jeans person is completely different. Well, just if you want to switch so that you're seeing the far side person presentation, let David know when he can. That's the button. I didn't know about it. There's a button for that? So my goal would be to have Luigi, Nora go first. Get rid of her. Midnight. Oh, she can go. She wants to hang out. If she wants to hang out, she can. I would. We'll just switch back to this. Nora, Eugene. Right, so I'm gonna grab a sandwich and I'll end it, okay? Okay. Thank you. Ben.